An Al Jazeera investigation has found no grounds for the Israeli army's claim that the strike on the al-Ahli Baptist Hospital was caused by a failed rocket launch. This comes as Tuesday's attack caused an uproar on social media, with people pointing fingers at who was behind the bombing. United States intelligence said their assessment supports claims by President Joe Biden and the Israeli government, blaming Palestinian terror factions for the bombing.
Journalist Michael Shellenberger wrote on X yesterday, "Citizens are spreading dangerous misinformation on social media platforms, say journalists and governments. But inaccurate stories on the Gaza hospital explosion prove that the most dangerous misinformation comes from not from citizens, but from journalists who rely on governments. In new reporting, public reporters make the case that governments and media are spreading misinformation on Israel and Gaza while demanding censorship." Joining us now to discuss is founder of the Public Substack, Michael Shellenberger. Thanks for joining us, Michael.
Good to be with you.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about what went into that tweet? This has been such a back and forth from initially we had Israel's digital spokesperson, Naftali, posting, yes, Israel is taking credit for the bombing in this hospital. It was a Hamas target. Then later you have the United States backtracking, saying, well, actually, we think that this might have been Hamas misfiring a rocket. Then later saying that it's jihad. Can you walk us through a little bit of what went into the sentiments you described in that tweet?
Sure. Well, I think it's important to understand that over the last 2 weeks, in the run-up to the bombing, or to the explosion, I should say, at the Gaza hospital, we had seen journalists and governments basically demanding significantly more censorship by X, formerly Twitter, of what they claim to be misinformation. And indeed, some of it, there has been a significant amount of misinformation on the platform. However, as we noted in the piece, we've also seen a lot of community notes attached to inaccurate information. The most famous examples are people taking video game footage and suggesting that it's real wartime footage from the Israeli-Gaza conflict. Very quickly, that had been tagged with community notes identifying it as video game footage, which instantly means that it's no longer misinformation. It's actually then accurate information. I pointed out earlier that the top censor of the European Union, a gentleman named Thierry Breton, had claimed that this was uncorrected misinformation on the site that had already been corrected. We also saw mainstream journalists from BBC, NBC, just attacking, X and Elon Musk and citizen journalists as having been horribly wrong. Well, there you were a few hours or a few days later. We see the mainstream news media rush to judgment in terms of attribution of the explosion at the hospital. Certainly, there's some of it that we know was misinformation, since it was a parking lot that was hit. One of the most egregious parts of this whole story is the New York Times carried a photo of a bombed out building that was not the hospital in question. I was in New York at the time at the airport. I saw those headlines. I was horrified. The picture in my mind was instantly that the Israeli Defense Forces had bombed the hospital. I should hasten to add that you just mentioned this Al Jazeera investigation. We don't know with certainty what exactly happened. We don't even know what the death toll was. As of yesterday, there was a European source who said it was just 10 to 50 deaths. U.S. intelligence said that there were somewhere between 100 and 300. But I think that the lesson here is that all of the things that the mainstream news media and governments, particularly the European Union, had been saying about citizen journalists and about social media posts, claiming that false news travels faster, that there's no so-called guardrails for citizen journalists on social media, in contrast to news media where there are supposed guardrails, or in contrast to pre-Elon Musk Twitter where you had guardrails. Well, here was a case where there were no guardrails on the part of the mainstream news media in attributing it to the Israeli Defense Forces. And even if that were to turn out to be the case, they did not have proof at the time. So I think that what you've seen, I think that the takeaway from the entire episode is a kind of leveling of the playing ground, whereby the news media is no better than citizen journalists. They spread misinformation just as much as anybody else. And one of the things that we talk about in the piece is just that one of the worst episodes of misinformation in contemporary U.S. history was when the U.S. government claimed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction that misinformation, disinformation actually, given that it was deliberate, was carried by the New York Times and other mainstream media and led directly to the U.S. invasion of Iraq. So I think that this discourse that suggests that there's citizen journalists and social media are uniquely irresponsible is not valid, maybe never has been, and certainly isn't after this Gaza hospital strike.
Yeah, I think that's a great point because, again, you had, for basically as long as I've been, in journalism school and now in the media, everybody's always kind of talked down and looked down at citizen journalists and people who are breaking really important stories and telling stories that often the mainstream media misses. They're somehow always viewed, like you were just saying, as being irresponsible and not having these guardrails, not having newsrooms, to support their work. But then we have situations like this that happen, and you have them basically just taking whatever the Hamas controlled, government minister there, I think it was the health ministry in Gaza, that first said, this was an Israeli airstrike that, supposedly was a mass casualty event and killed 500 people. Most of that, as you pointed out, has been debunked. It was a parking lot. We haven't seen the death toll look like it's going to be that high, and we have, the U.S. intelligence community, we have IDF saying that this was not Israel striking that area. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little about this as a space you've been in a long time. How did we get to a point where these mainstream outlets that supposedly have these guardrails, clearly they all failed, and these aren't newsrooms where somebody went rogue to publish these stories. All of these stories went through the same sort of processes that anything else would go through. So can you talk a little bit about what's going on inside those newsrooms that has gotten to the point where they didn't see any issue with running unverified reports from somebody who's essentially a member of Hamas?
Yeah, it's a really great question. There's a lot to unpack there. I think one of the first things is that actually the news media have been getting rid of the guardrails. One of the most important guardrails in the legacy news media were these older, crusty, often curmudgeonly. There's a sort of stereotype that we have. I think it has a good amount of accuracy to it, of kind of the old guys and the old ladies that had been in the newspapers for 20, 30 years. Many of them were driven out, often on politically correct terms. We wrote about this in the context of COVID origins, that the New York Times lost Donald McNeil, who was kind of canceled for using insensitive language. It's absolutely ridiculous what they drove him out over, but they ended up driving out people that would have been a more skeptical voice, as someone with a little bit more experience, to say, hey, I remember back in the 70s, we got this issue wrong and we could be making the same mistake. So I think the first thing is that a lot of those people were purged for irrational reasons over the last several years. The second thing, though, is the speed issue is one that has been used to attack social media. There's a false claim based on a badly done MIT study, but you'll hear it repeated a lot, where people say that false news travels 6 times faster than accurate news. It's based on a highly selective number of tweets from several years ago and used to generalize across the whole internet. There's this idea that, well, maybe the newspapers shouldn't have published so quickly. I think actually the headline just should have been different. The story should have been different. They should have just said that there was an explosion, there was deaths, but we don't know how serious it is, and we don't know who did it, and that you could report that both sides are blaming the other. But I think that the initial headlines, obviously exaggerated the certainty that the newspapers had in reporting it. And then I think the third factor here is just that there's an economic competition between legacy news media and startup news media. We saw this really dramatically in the attacks on Joe Rogan, which occurred, I guess it was last year, or maybe it was earlier this year. But it was, where basically all of the media attacked Joe Rogan for, taking ivermectin. And it was just absurd. And it was clear that this is really about a competition over advertising dollars. So I think that I think most people don't realize, but, the social media have been sending fewer of their readers to legacy news media outlets. At Facebook, that's just because Mark Zuckerberg got tired of being beat up all the time and being pulled before Congress. It was already declining before Elon took over Twitter, but it's declined more since then, so that Facebook and X both have an interest in keeping readers on their platforms rather than sending the readers off to other newspapers. So you just see a concerted effort by everybody, CBS, NBC, the New York Times, Rolling Stone, others all attacking X for so-called misinformation on the site. They have an interest in doing that. They want to establish themselves as having more credibility than the social media platforms or citizen journalists. And I think, John Burns Murdoch, a pretty good digital reporter at the Financial Times, wrote a really thoughtful thread a couple of days, or maybe yesterday, explaining that this Gaza hospital misreporting is a pretty serious blow to the credibility and legitimacy of news media, certainly a pretty significant blow to their ability to claim to have some advantage in terms of guardrails over alternative and independent citizen journalists.
I think a lot of the initial reports of the 40 beheaded babies and how gruesome Hamas's attack on Israel was led to a lot of, just discontent, disgust, a lot of people on social media taking a stance, posting they stand with Israel, and a lot of news media covering this specific episode. And then Joe Biden to later say, although he initially said he saw confirmed photographic evidence of this, that there is no confirmation that this actually happened. And it seems to me that the news media tends to move on at that point rather than correcting the stories they originally ran. And I think that's the main problem here. I think the burden of proof here is that, if you're legacy media and you want censorship, you have to prove that you can accurately report on stories and will correct yourself when you do not. If you don't have that, of course, your journalistic standards and efficacy of your journalism is the same as a citizen journalist. And so the burden of proof is just that censorship is worse. We're not gaining anything from it because wartime reporting is chaotic. We're going to have stories like this happen. But to me, it seems that it's a huge problem that legacy media is not correcting themselves. And now we have so much focus on this hospital bombing instead of a lot of the other things that are going on that are confirmed in Gaza. And it seems that they've derailed the conversation, perhaps intentionally, I would say. And when you have the Biden administration not able to confirm intelligence from Israel, I really want to get your opinion on this, that, of course, Israel is an ally. We should know what they're using a lot of our financial support for their military is going towards. And if we ask, hey, was it y'all that bombed this hospital? We should be able to get a straightforward response. It seems that either that didn't happen or Joe Biden is not being honest. And citizen journalists are all we have to rely on if the legacy media is, relying on governments. So what do you make of Joe Biden even saying he doesn't know what's happened here?
Yeah, well, there's so much there, Jess, to unpack, but I think you raised some super important issues. Let's just start with the beheaded babies. I mean, this is something where you would see this claim that there were these beheaded babies, and then there was this claim, then people said, well, we don't know how many were beheaded. And then there were people that sort of ridiculed the idea that it was important to figure out how many there were. Obviously, it is not unimportant to figure that out. As a journalist, you care very much about how many beheaded babies there were. I mean, it sounds kind of like a crazy thing that you have to even talk about, but of course you should want to know a specific number. We should want to know specific death counts. This is what a journalist does. There's certainly a lot of voices on social media, obviously, that are looking for every atrocity as an opportunity to score some points in some irrational idea, in my view, that it would make a significant difference in people's opinions. But journalists should not care about that. Journalists should just care about getting the information accurate. Just to go back to the Iraq war situation, I remember at the time, there were people who said there's no evidence that Iraq has a weapons of mass destruction program. They are not close to developing a nuclear weapon. And they were criticized as sort of being soft on Saddam Hussein, which is also just absurd. If you want to get accurate information on what Saddam Hussein is doing, or how many babies were beheaded, or how many people were killed at the hospital, this is the job of the reporter. And you must be absolutely immune to the criticism that somehow you're being soft or biased or something by wanting to get the facts. That's the job of that. That's why those journalists get sort of, grumpy and curmudgeonly in their old age in the newsrooms, because they're there to say, hey, I don't care how emotional and irrational our readers are right now. We're going to get to the bottom of this. So I do think that there's great reason to be skeptical of official sources. I mean, you have to remember that here we are coming from a period where we saw official sources either accidentally or deliberately lie to the American people about the origins of the COVID virus, about the efficacy of the COVID vaccine, about the veracity of the Hunter Biden laptop, all of this on top of decades of governments lying to their populations about a whole range of things. So the idea that, and I'm sort of in the midst of an argument right now about wind turbines in Wales, where people are attempting to debunk us by claiming that because the official government sources say one thing, our more recent data is somehow invalid. That's authoritarian mentality. So the mentality that wants to censor citizen voices or dissident voices or disfavored views, it's an authoritarian view. And questioning the president, questioning intelligence services, this is the bread and butter of journalism. So I do think ultimately the change that needs to occur is with the readers. I think we are seeing journalists showing up. Certainly our organization is very committed to this, showing up saying, we want to get to the facts of this. We don't care whose feelings are hurt or whether you think it's going to cause some advantage to one side or the other. We have to get to the bottom of this. We should report accurately when we don't know. Readers need to know that. And I think that readers need to appreciate when the sources of information they're getting are actually showing some restraint and showing some fairness. And they need to check their own little voices and their own sides that want something to be right or wrong. If you want to think the worst of the Israeli Defense Forces and you find yourself hoping that it's true, that they bombed the hospital and sort of rooting for that, maybe put a little check on yourself. Maybe that's not the case. Or if you find yourself hoping to prove that Hamas beheaded 40 babies, maybe take a minute and pause and ask yourself whether or not you really have reason to believe that, or if there's some impulse in you that is demanding that you desire it. I think that we're all very comfortable in the West and in the United States, and some of that privilege and that comfort we get is not wanting to be exposed to disconfirmatory information, because actually it's more comfortable to have your prior views reinforced than to have them challenged. And so I do think ultimately there's a change that needs to occur among citizens, or what we call news consumers, is to actually welcome having publications tell you things that you didn't want to hear but appear to be accurate, or getting you to hold off and accept some amount of uncertainty. It's not a very satisfying answer, but I think it's the only way that you're going to restore some trust in multiple outlets. And the final thing I would just say about it is just that I think that we've moved beyond a place where you can trust a single person. You can't trust Walter Cronkite. I don't think you should blindly trust Michael Shellenberger. You should question what we're reporting and get your news from a lot of different places. And that's the real promise of social media. There's these voices that want to censor information online, or that want to make it so that we rely more on official sources. Those days are over. We're not going to put the genie of social media back in the bottle. We're not going back to the 1950s where we can trust everything Walter Cronkite of the New York Times says. Let's embrace this new moment, which is that you get multiple perspectives. You accept the uncertainty and the ambiguity, particularly in moments of war, and stop being in such a hurry to get what we call epistemic closure or certainty. Allow yourself to live with a few days of not knowing certain things, because that's just life, and in particular, that's what we see during wartime.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those times where maybe it's good to step outside of the echo chamber every once in a while to hear a different idea. Michael, it is always so great having you with us and getting your perspective. We'll be back with more Rising right after this.
Thanks, guys.